So I woke up yesterday morning to the news of another terror attack. In fact, two terror attacks. There was one in Kabul and one in London. And as always in these attacks, my sympathies and my thoughts, my heart goes out to the victims and their families. The news coming out of these places is of obviously unspeakable horror, and it beggars belief that anyone could support these kind of attacks. And yet our government, the British government, does support these kind of attacks and has done systematically as a tool of its foreign policy. In 2011, a vicious racist insurgency began in Libya, and the British government supported it openly. The insurgency targeted soldiers, police, African migrants and black-skinned Libyans. The British government led the calls for military intervention on the side of the insurgency, calls which eventually led to a 7-month NATO bombing campaign against Libya, resulting in the total destruction and obliteration of the Libyan state, a once peaceful and prosperous state, and to the seizing of power by the insurgents. And the British government knew precisely the nature of the forces that it was backing. On the second day of the rebellion, this is around a month before the NATO campaign got underway. On the second day of the rebellion, it was reported in mainstream media that the rebels had captured around 50 African migrants, locked them in a police cell that they'd taken over, and burnt them alive. Early reports from the early days of the insurrection reported building workers from Chad, around 70 to 80, being hacked to pieces by the rebels. And this is the nature of the insurgency that Britain was supporting. The involvement, likewise, of Al-Qaeda was well known. For years, Britain had harboured the Libyan Islamic fighting group and its fighters, sheltered them, given them refuge and so on in Britain. And this group was the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Libya. And its main leader, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, became the commander of the rebels' forces in Tripoli, the Tripoli Brigade. His job was to coordinate with NATO the attack on Tripoli. So in many ways, Belhaj was NATO's leading man on the ground in Libya. And this was the man who was openly the leader for 15 years of Al-Qaeda's Libyan affiliate, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. So Britain knew exactly who it was bringing to power. It knew exactly the forces that it was involved with, the same forces that would go on to become ISIS. And it supported the rebellion. So where does Theresa May come in? Well, since 2005, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group had actually been proscribed as a terrorist organization by both Britain and the US. And its fighters in Britain, many of them were placed under what are called control orders, a form of house arrest. Yet when the insurgency broke out in Libya in 2011, the control orders were suddenly lifted to enable these fighters to go and join the British-sponsored Al-Qaeda rebellion in Libya. The fighters included Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber, as well as his father. Salman Abedi at the time was 16 years old, and his father was a known member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Libya's Al-Qaeda affiliate. So who was responsible for this policy of lifting these orders so that these known Al-Qaeda members could go and fight and train in Libya? Well, control orders come under the remit of the Home Office, the responsibility of the Home Office. And who was the Home Secretary in 2011? Theresa May. So Theresa May personally was responsible for changing the status of known Al-Qaeda members, including the Manchester bomber's father, to ensure that he could travel unimpeded and they could travel unimpeded to train and fight in an Al-Qaeda led insurgency in Libya. And the same policy applied to Syria as well. But that's not all. Anytime someone on the terror watch list tries to leave or enter the country, automatically a warning is flagged up to alert the border control officials, who can in turn alert the counter-terrorism police. So some of these fighters were actually stopped and questioned by counter-terror police. But MI5 overruled them to ensure that they could travel freely to and from these training camps and so on in Libya and Syria. And literally you can read about this. This is well documented. There's an article on Middle East Eye recently called Sorted by MI5. Literally people would be stopped, these fighters would be stopped by counter-terror police because their names had triggered a warning. And they would literally get on the phone to their friends in MI5, and MI5 would overrule the police to allow them to travel back and forth freely. And again, who is responsible for MI5? MI5 comes under the responsibility of the Home Office. So again, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, personally implemented a policy that allowed counter-terror police to be overruled to allow fighters, known fighters, often known members of Al-Qaeda, to travel freely between Britain and training camps in Libya and Syria to go and fight and train with Al-Qaeda and latterly ISIS and so on. So let's just recap here. We know that not only did Britain turn peaceful and stable states like Iraq and Libya into failed states that have become effectively safe havens for terrorist groups. Not only is Britain maintaining an alliance and is actually the biggest weapons dealer to Saudi Arabia, which is in turn one of the biggest state sponsors of terrorism. It was legal for the first 2 years of ISIS's existence in Saudi Arabia, for example, to actually openly fund ISIS. Not only did the British government openly fund, equip and train fighters in these insurgencies in Libya and Syria, insurgencies which it knew itself to be led by Al-Qaeda and associated groups, but we now know also that Theresa May herself actually had a policy to ensure that counter-terror police could be overruled to allow the unimpeded travel back and forth between Britain and terror training camps of fighters in Libya and Syria. And this included Salman Abedi. Salman Abedi returned from his final trip to Libya, presumably his final training session with ISIS just a few days before the Manchester attack. Now we know he was on a terrorist watch list, so this would have triggered a warning. But thanks to Theresa May's policy, this warning was overridden. So that's the state that we're in right now. And the British government has blood on its hands, without a shadow of doubt. It has already the blood of millions of Iraqis, Syrians, Libyans, Afghans, Nigerians, Algerians, Tunisians, Pakistanis, and others who have suffered from attacks by these groups. But now to that can be added that the British government has the blood of 22 Mancunians and 7 more Londoners. The British government, the cabinet, Theresa May and her cabinet, these people are complicit in murder. They're war criminals. And if the Nuremberg principles, the principles established by the Nuremberg Tribunal, established after World War II, were applied, then they would be hung.